Hey, it's Ellis Social Studies.
Hey guys, and welcome back to Sheila Social Studies. Today we're going to be covering our third round of immigration into the United States, as well as some urbanization. Now, some of this stuff may seem like it's a review, but it's truthfully not. But what we have to remember in American history is that history is cyclical. It will happen over and over and over again, and we just have to kind of learn from it when something goes bad. But history will return, and it will go in cycles. So right now we're going to talk about the rush of immigrants into America. So as you remember in previous chapters in CLS Social Studies, we've discussed what we call the old immigrants. You have to remember that they were the second round of European immigration to the United States after the British in the 1600s and the 1700s. Between the years of 1840 and 1860, the old immigrants came predominantly from European countries like Ireland and Germany, with some British and Scandinavians sprinkled in. The Irish left. Their push factor was because of the Great Potato Famine, and the Germans left because of a lot of political unrest. Religiously, they were a faith-based group, with the majority being Protestant practicing immigrants, and more specifically, the Irish were Catholics. Work-wise, the Irish moved into those big cities in the Atlantic coast up in the Northeast, and they took up factory jobs that did not require any skill. And the Germans moved to the rural Midwest and took up farming. And for the next few decades, these old immigrants became Americanized and began to root themselves in daily life. Now, between the years of 1880 and 1917, which ends around 1920, another group of immigrants made a mass migration to the United States. This third round of immigrants, or new immigrants, arrived en masse from Southern and Eastern Europe. Overall, more than 20 million immigrants stemming from Italy, Poland, Greece, Russia, and China, with a large portion of them, over 4 million, coming from Italy alone. Unlike the old immigrants, there were a plethora of diverse cultures and religious backgrounds. However, just like the Irish immigrants, the new immigrants relocated to these big cities for job opportunities as well. So, what about the immigrants' journey to America? Well, immigrants faced a difficult journey traveling to the United States. Remember, there were no commercial airlines to fly them in just a matter of hours. And because most of them were poor or had very little wealth, they traveled in the steerage compartment, which was the area under the ship's deck, where filth, sickness, and disease would be easily spread. Upon arriving in America, these new immigrants were required to enter through immigration processing centers, which were run by state and local governments. And when the immigrants entered the processing centers, they would be interviewed by officers who would make a determination to allow them entrance into the country or not. Sometimes immigrant families were forced to stay at the processing centers for weeks or months while their family was investigated. If there was any sign of criminal activity or sickness in the family, they'd be denied entry into the United States. And over the years, hundreds of babies were actually born at these processing centers as well, while waiting for the conclusion of the investigation. So let's go into some of these processing centers that we're talking about. Entrance into the United States was primarily done through these processing centers, and there was 3 of them, which were the largest. On the East Coast, Ellis Island was the busiest immigration center. Opened in 1892, immigrants from Europe began to flood Ellis Island, hoping to become American citizens. On their journey, over 12 million immigrants sailed into New York Harbor, passed by the Statue of Liberty, and arrived at the processing center to be interviewed. The statue was famous for letting immigrants know that they made it and they had a chance. Overall, less than 2% of arrivals were denied entry into the United States. On the west coast of the United States, Angel Island, located just north of San Francisco, was the primary entry point into the country. Opening in 1910, Angel Island was the main entrance into America for the likes of the Chinese immigrants. The process of arrival was tricky for many Chinese because by law, the only Chinese immigrants who were allowed to entrance into the country were people whose fathers were already U.S. citizens. In the Southwest, El Paso, Texas, had the main processing center for immigrants arriving up from Mexico. And many of the Mexican immigrants settled in the Southwest and found work on large commercial farms, doing mining work, construction work, and even work in the steel mills. So let's talk about their relocation. When the new immigrants came to America, they would move into neighborhoods with others from their homeland because they would share common cultures. These culture areas were important because many of the new residents could not speak English, and they relied on family or friends who had moved to America beforehand. City cultural areas have very distinct names even today, like Chinatown, Greektown, and Little Italy. Immigrants left their homeland with not much more than they could carry in their luggage, and oftentimes they did not have any money either. In order for the new immigrant to succeed, many business owners who were previous immigrants themselves or shared their same heritage would offer to help the new arrivals by offering credit or loans to purchase everyday items. Some communities formed benevolent societies, which were set up for the purpose to help new immigrants in the case of unemployment, sickness, or death. The daily life of the immigrant coming into America, the new immigrant, it was rough. When the immigrants moved to the United States, they did not have many options where they would be able to move to. With very little money saved up, many of them had to move into tenements, which were small, very cramped apartment buildings that were usually old, dirty, and falling apart. And the buildings were more often a cesspool of diseases than anything else. Many new immigrants were farmers in their homelands, but upon their arrival in America, they had to find jobs in the cities in which they moved. Just like the Irish during the second great wave of immigration, the Italians, Greeks, and Chinese had to take unskilled jobs that were low-paying in construction or garment fields and steel factories. Almost all the new laborers worked long hours for very little pay in the textile mills or small garment shops that were called sweatshops. Many times the workers stayed at work for all 3 meals, working without breaks and having no type of communication with their family. Some new immigrants who arrived with or acquired skills in a certain field of work were able to find work in many different occupations. Once settled, some of the newest Americans who had saved money, shared or borrowed money, would open small businesses in their cultural areas like restaurants, garment shops, or delicatessens. In the West, many of the Mexican immigrants worked on farms located in areas like Texas and California. Was there resistance to this new round of immigrants like there was during the last round of immigrants? I believe so. Remember, it's cyclical. It happens in cycles now, right? So as people from the European and Asian continent kept arriving in the United States, anti-immigrant feelings grew. Political cartoons would often invoke negative feelings for non-Americans in the 1880s through 1920s. Some cartoons would show an immigrant carrying a bag full of things like poverty, disease, and anarchy, walking towards a suspicious Uncle Sam. While factory owners welcomed the new cheap labor source, many American workers did not share the same warm feelings. These nativists, or someone who opposed immigration and supported native-born inhabitants, held racial and ethnic prejudices against immigrants for many reasons. One reason that stood out well above the rest was jobs. Many nativist unions and workers resisted immigration because they feared the new immigrants would take their jobs, as they were willing to work for lower pay. Many nativists feared that the new immigrants would not bother to learn American customs, which would be destructive to the American society. Nativists took out their frustration on immigrants in different ways. Some emerged in violence, while others advocated for laws that would severely limit immigration to the United States. It was the latter group of nativists that were most successful. Nativists that pushed Congress to pass laws limiting immigrants into the country were relieved to hear that in 1882, President Chester A. Arthur and Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which eliminated the immigration of Chinese people into America for 10 years, and Congress refused state and federal courts the right to grant citizenship to any resident aliens. Later, new immigration laws were passed and restricted convicts, immigrants with certain communicable diseases, and those that were likely to receive public assistance from entering into the United States. So how's about North Carolina and this third wave of immigration? Well, when the new immigrants came to America, the population increased dramatically, but it was spread out through the country. Yes, it was kind of spread out through the country, but not areas in the rural South. North Carolina did not see a huge influx of new immigrants that would aid in local economy because when the immigrants arrived, they moved to cities where work was plentiful. This meant the city needed to be large, and North Carolina did not have any large cities that were large enough to compete with cities like New York, Chicago, or St. Louis. North Carolina was not completely left out, however, because many immigrants were farmers when they arrived, and some Italian, German, and Dutch immigrants would relocate to North Carolina to take up farming, in which we do very well. All right, I'll see you next time.